Uganda. Officially, the Republic of Uganda is a landlocked country in East Africa. It is bordered to the east by Kenya, to the north by South Sudan, to the west by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to the southwest by Rwanda, and to the south by Tanzania. The southern part includes a substantial portion of Lake Victoria, shared with Kenya and Tanzania. Uganda is in the African Great Lakes region. It lies within the Nile Basin, and has a varied equatorial climate. As of 2024, it has a population of over 49 million, of which 8.5 million live in the capital and largest city, Kampala. Uganda is named after the Buganda Kingdom, which encompasses a large portion of the south, including Kampala, and whose language Luganda is widely spoken. The official language is English. The region was populated by various ethnic groups before Bantu and Nilotic groups arrived around 3,000 years ago. These groups established influential kingdoms such as the Empire of Kidira. The arrival of Arab traders in the 1830s and British explorers in the late 19th century marked the beginning of foreign influence. The British established the Protectorate of Uganda in 1894, incorporating various kingdoms and setting the stage for future political dynamics. Uganda gained independence in 1962, with Milton Obote as the first prime minister. The 1966 Mengo crisis marked a significant conflict with the Buganda Kingdom. Idi Amin's military coup in 1971 led to a brutal regime characterized by mass killings and economic decline, until his overthrow in 1979. Yoweri Museveni's national resistance movement took power in 1986 after a 6-year guerrilla war. This brought stability and growth, but authoritarian practices and human rights abuses. The abolition of presidential term limits, allegations of electoral fraud and repression, have raised concerns about Uganda's democratic future. Museveni was elected president in the 2011, 2016, and 2021 general elections. Human rights issues, corruption, and regional conflicts, such as involvement in the Congo Wars and the struggle against the Lord's Resistance Army, continue to challenge Uganda. Despite this, it has made progress in education and health, improving literacy and reducing HIV infection, though challenges in maternal health and gender inequality persist. The country's future depends on addressing governance and human rights, while leveraging its natural and human resources for sustainable development. Geographically, Uganda is diverse, with volcanic hills, mountains, and lakes, including Lake Victoria, the world's second-largest freshwater lake. The country has significant natural resources, including fertile agricultural land and untapped oil reserves, contributing to its economic development. The service sector dominates the economy, surpassing agriculture. Uganda's rich biodiversity, with national parks and wildlife reserves, attracts tourism, a vital sector for the economy. Uganda is a member of the United Nations, the African Union, G77, the East African Community, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. History. Much of Uganda was inhabited by Central Sudanic and Koliak-speaking farmers and herders until 3,000 years ago, when Bantu speakers arrived in the south and Nilotic speakers arrived in the northeast. By 1500 AD, they had all been assimilated into Bantu-speaking cultures south of Mount Elgon, the Nile River, and Lake Kigga. According to oral tradition and archaeological studies, the Empire of Kidira covered an important part of the Great Lakes area, from the northern lakes Albert and Kigga to the southern lakes Victoria and Tanganyika. Kidira is claimed as the antecedent of the Toro, Ankole, and Buzaga kingdoms. Some Luo invaded Kidira and assimilated with the Bantu society there, establishing the Byato dynasty of the current Omukama of Bunyoro Kidira. Arab traders moved into the land from the Indian Ocean coast of East Africa in the 1830s for trade and commerce. In the late 1860s, Bunyoro in midwestern Uganda found itself threatened from the north by Egyptian-sponsored agents. Unlike the Arab traders from the East African coast who sought trade, these agents were promoting foreign conquest. In 1869, Khedive Ismail Pasha of Egypt, seeking to annex the territories north of the borders of Lake Victoria and east of Lake Albert and south of Gondokoro, sent a British explorer, Samuel Baker, on a military expedition to the frontiers of northern Uganda, with the objective of suppressing the slave trade there and opening the way to commerce and civilization. The Bunyoro resisted Baker, who had to fight a desperate battle to secure his retreat. Baker regarded the resistance as an act of treachery, and he denounced the Bunyoro in a book that was widely read in Britain. Later, the British arrived in Uganda with a predisposition against the Kingdom of Bunyoro and sided with the Kingdom of Buganda. This would eventually cost Bunyoro half of its territory, which was given to Buganda as a reward from the British. Two of the numerous lost counties were restored to Bunyoro after independence. In the 1860s, while Arabs sought influence from the north, British explorers searching for the source of the Nile arrived in Uganda. They were followed by British Anglican missionaries who arrived in the Kingdom of Buganda in 1877 and French Catholic missionaries in 1879. This situation gave rise to the death of the Uganda martyrs in 1885 after the conversion of Mutesa I and much of his court, and the succession of his anti-Christian son Mwanga. The British government chartered the Imperial British East Africa Company to negotiate trade agreements in the region beginning in 1888. From 1886, there was a series of religious wars in Buganda, initially between Muslims and Christians and then, from 1890, between Ba Ingles Protestants and Ba Franza Catholics, factions named after the imperial powers with which they were aligned. Because of civil unrest and financial burdens, IBC claimed that it was unable to maintain their occupation in the region. British commercial interests were ardent to protect the trade route of the Nile, which prompted the British government to annex Buganda and adjoining territories to create the Uganda Protectorate in 1894. Uganda Protectorate. The Protectorate of Uganda was a protectorate of the British Empire from 1894 to 1962. In 1893, the Imperial British East Africa Company transferred its administration rights of territory consisting mainly of the Kingdom of Buganda to the British government. The IBC relinquished its control over Uganda after Ugandan internal religious wars had driven it into bankruptcy. In 1894, the Uganda Protectorate was established, and the territory was extended beyond the borders of Buganda by signing more treaties with the other kingdoms to an area that roughly corresponds to that of present-day Uganda. The status of protectorate had significantly different consequences for Uganda than had the region been made a colony like neighboring Kenya, insofar as Uganda retained a degree of self-government that would have otherwise been limited under a full colonial administration. In the 1890s, 32,000 laborers from British India were recruited to East Africa under indentured labor contracts to construct the Uganda Railway. Most of the surviving Indians returned home, but 6,724 decided to remain in East Africa after the line's completion. Subsequently, some became traders and took control of cotton ginning and sartorial retail. From 1900 to 1920, a sleeping sickness epidemic in the southern part of Uganda, along the north shores of Lake Victoria, killed more than 250,000 people. World War II encouraged the colonial administration of Uganda to recruit 77,143 soldiers to serve in the King's African Rifles. They were seen in action in the Western Desert Campaign, the Abyssinian Campaign, the Battle of Madagascar and the Burma Campaign. Independence. Uganda gained independence from the UK on October 9, 1962 with Queen Elizabeth II as head of state and Queen of Uganda. In October 1963, Uganda became a republic but maintained its membership in the Commonwealth of Nations. The first post-independence election, held in 1962, was won by an alliance between the Uganda People's Congress and Kabaka. UPC and KY formed the first post-independence government with Milton Obote as executive prime minister, with the Buganda Kabaka Edward Mutisa II holding the largely ceremonial position of president. Buganda crisis. Uganda's immediate post-independence years were dominated by the relationship between the central government and the largest regional kingdom, Buganda. From the moment the British created the Uganda Protectorate, the issue of how to manage the largest monarchy within the framework of a unitary state had always been a problem. Colonial governors had failed to come up with a formula that worked. This was further complicated by Buganda's nonchalant attitude to its relationship with the central government. Buganda never sought independence but rather appeared to be comfortable with a loose arrangement that guaranteed them privileges above the other subjects within the protectorate or a special status when the British left. This was evidenced in part by hostilities between the British colonial authorities and Buganda prior to independence. Within Buganda, there were divisions, between those who wanted the Kabaka to remain a dominant monarch and those who wanted to join with the rest of Uganda to create a modern secular state. The split resulted in the creation of two dominant Buganda-based parties, the Kabaka KY, and the Democratic Party that had roots in the Catholic Church. The bitterness between these two parties was extremely intense, especially as the first elections for the post-colonial parliament approached. The Kabaka particularly disliked the DP leader, Benedicto Kiwanuka. Outside Buganda, a soft-spoken politician from northern Uganda, Milton Obote, had forged an alliance of non-Buganda politicians to form the Uganda People's Congress. The UPC at its heart was dominated by politicians who wanted to rectify what they saw as the regional inequality that favored Buganda's special status. This drew in substantial support from outside Buganda. The party, however, remained a loose alliance of interests, but Obote showed great skill at negotiating them into a common ground based on a federal formula. At independence, the Buganda question remained unresolved. Uganda was one of the few colonial territories that achieved independence without a dominant political party with a clear majority in parliament. In the pre-independence elections, the UPC ran no candidates in Buganda and won 37 of the 61 directly elected seats outside Buganda. The DP won 24 seats outside Buganda. The special status granted to Buganda meant that the 21 Buganda seats were elected by proportional representation reflecting the elections to the Buganda Parliament, the Lukako. KY won a resounding victory over DP, winning all 21 seats. The UPC reached a high at the end of 1964 when the leader of the DP in Parliament, Basil Kiiza Bateringaya, crossed the parliamentary floor with 5 other MPs, leaving DP with only 9 seats. The DP MPs were not particularly happy that the hostility of their leader, Benedicto Kiwanuka, towards the Kabaka was hindering their chances of compromise with KY. The trickle of defections turned into a flood when 10 KY members crossed the floor when they realized the formal coalition with the UPC was no longer viable. Obote's charismatic speeches across the country were sweeping all before him, and the UPC was winning almost every local election held and increasing its control over all district councils and legislatures outside Buganda. The response from the Kabaka was mute, probably content in his ceremonial role and symbolism in his part of the country. However, there were also major divisions within his palace that made it difficult for him to act effectively against Obote. By the time Uganda had become independent, Buganda was a divided house with contending social and political forces. There were however problems brewing inside the UPC. As its ranks swelled, the ethnic, religious, regional, and personal interests began to shake the party. The party's apparent strength was eroded in a complex sequence of factional conflicts in its central and regional structures. And by 1966, the UPC was tearing itself apart. The conflicts were further intensified by the newcomers who had crossed the parliamentary floor from DP and KY. The UPC delegates arrived in Gulu in 1964 for their delegates' conference. Here was the first demonstration as to how Abiy was losing control of his party. The battle over the Secretary-General of the party was a bitter contest between the New Moderates candidate, Grace Ibingara, and the radical John Kakage. Ibingara subsequently became the symbol of the opposition to Abiy within the UPC. This is an important factor when looking at the subsequent events that led to the crisis between Buganda and the central government. For those outside the UPC, including KY supporters, this was a sign that Abiy was vulnerable. Keen observers realized the UPC was not a cohesive unit. The collapse of the UPC-KY alliance openly revealed the dissatisfaction Abiy and others had about Buganda's special status. In 1964, the government responded to demands from some parts of the vast Buganda kingdom that they were not the Kabaka's subjects. Prior to colonial rule, Buganda had been rivaled by the neighboring Bunyoro kingdom. Buganda had conquered parts of Bunyoro and the British colonialists had formalized this in the Buganda agreements. Known as the Lost Counties, the people in these areas wished to revert to being part of Bunyoro. Abiy decided to allow a referendum, which angered the Kabaka and most of the rest of Buganda. The residents of the counties voted to return to Bunyoro despite the Kabaka's attempts to influence the vote. Having lost the referendum, KY opposed the bill to pass the counties to Bunyoro, thus ending the alliance with the UPC. The tribal nature of Ugandan politics was also manifesting itself in government. The UPC, which had previously been a national party, began to break along tribal lines when Ibingara challenged Abiy in the UPC. The North-South ethnic divide that had been evident in economic and social spheres now entrenched itself in politics. Abiy surrounded himself with mainly northern politicians, while Ibingara's supporters, who were subsequently arrested and jailed with him, were mainly from the south. In time, the two factions acquired ethnic labels, Bantu and Nilotic. The perception that the government was at war with the Bantu was further enhanced when Abiy arrested and imprisoned the mainly Bantu ministers who backed Ibingara. These labels brought into the mix two very powerful influences. First, Buganda. The people of Buganda are Bantu and therefore naturally aligned to the Ibingara faction. The Ibingara faction further advanced this alliance by accusing Abiy of wanting to overthrow the Kabaka. They were now aligned to opposing Abiy. Second, the security forces. The British colonialists had recruited the army and police almost exclusively from northern Uganda due to their perceived suitability for these roles. At independence, the army and police was dominated by northern tribes, mainly Nilotic. They would now feel more affiliated to Abiy, and he took full advantage of this to consolidate his power. In April 1966, Abiy passed out 800 new army recruits at Marato, of whom 70% came from the northern region. At the time there was a tendency to perceive central government and security forces as dominated by northerners, particularly the Akoli, who through the UPC had significant access to government positions at national level. In northern Uganda there were also varied degrees of anti-Buganda feelings, particularly over the kingdom's special status before and after independence, and all the economic and social benefits that came with this status. Abiy brought significant numbers of northerners into the central state, both through the civil service and military, and created a patronage machine in northern Uganda. However, Both Bantu and Nilotic labels represent significant ambiguities. The Bantu category, for example, includes both Buganda and Bunyoro, historically bitter rivals. The Nilotic label includes the Lugbara, Akoli, and Langi, all of whom have bitter rivalries that were to define Uganda's military politics later. Despite these ambiguities, these events unwittingly brought to fore the northerner-southerner political divide, which to some extent still influences Ugandan politics. The UPC fragmentation continued as opponents sensed Obote's vulnerability. At local level, where the UPC dominated most councils, discontent began to challenge incumbent council leaders. Even in Obote's home district, attempts were made to oust the head of the local district council in 1966. A more worrying fact for the UPC was that the next national elections loomed in 1967, and without the support of KY, who were now likely to back the DP, and the growing factionalism in the UPC, there was the real possibility that the UPC would be out of power in months. Obote went after KY with a new Act of Parliament in early 1966 that blocked any attempt by KY to expand outside Buganda. KY appeared to respond in Parliament through one of their few remaining MPs, the terminally ill Dodi Ochieng. Ochieng was an irony, although from northern Uganda, he had risen high in the ranks of KY and become a close confidant to the Kabaka, who had gifted him with large land titles in Buganda. In Obote's absence from Parliament, Ochieng laid bare the illegal plundering of ivory and gold from the Congo that had been orchestrated by Obote's Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Idi Amin. He further alleged that Obote, Onama, and Nikon had all benefited from the scheme. Parliament overwhelmingly voted in favor of a motion to censure Amin and investigate Obote's involvement. This shook the government and raised tensions in the country. KY further demonstrated its ability to challenge Obote from within his party at the UPC Buganda conference, where Godfrey Binaza was ousted by a faction believed to have the backing of KY, Ibingara and other anti-Obote elements in Buganda. Obote's response was to arrest Ibingara and other ministers at a cabinet meeting and to assume special powers in February 1966. In March 1966, Obote also announced that the offices of President and Vice President would cease to exist, effectively dismissing the Kabaka. Obote also gave Amin more power, giving him the army commander position over the previous holder, who had relations to Buganda through marriage, possibly believing Palat would be reluctant to take military action against the Kabaka if it came to that. Obote abolished the constitution and effectively suspended elections due in a few months. Obote went on television and radio to accuse the Kabaka of various offenses, including requesting foreign troops, which appears to have been explored by the Kabaka following the rumors of Amin plotting a coup. Obote further dismantled the authority of the Kabaka by announcing, among other measures, the abolition of independent public service commissions for federal units. This removed the Kabaka's authority to appoint civil servants in Buganda. The abolition of the Buganda High Court, removing any judicial authority the Kabaka had. The bringing of Buganda financial management under further central control. Abolition of lands for Buganda chiefs. Land is one of the key sources of Kabaka's power over his subjects. The lines were now drawn for a showdown between Buganda and the central government. Historians may argue about whether this could have been avoided through compromise. This was unlikely, as Obote now felt emboldened and saw the Kabaka as weak. Indeed, by accepting the presidency 4 years earlier and siding with the UPC, the Kabaka had divided his people and taken the side of one against the other. Within Buganda's political institutions, rivalries driven by religion and personal ambition made the institutions ineffective and unable to respond to the central government moves. The Kabaka was often regarded as aloof and unresponsive to advice from the younger Buganda politicians who better understood the new post-independence politics, unlike the traditionalists who were ambivalent to what was going on as long as their traditional benefits were maintained. The Kabaka favored the neo-traditionalists. In May 1966, the Kabaka made his move. He asked for foreign help, and the Buganda parliament demanded that the Uganda government leave Buganda, including the capital, Kampala. In response, Abiy ordered Idi Amin to attack the Kabaka's palace. The battle for the Kabaka's palace was fierce, the Kabaka's guards putting up more resistance than had been expected. The British-trained captain, the Kabaka, with about 120 armed men, kept Idi Amin at bay for 12 hours. It is estimated that up to 2,000 people died in the battle, which ended when the army called in heavier guns and overran the palace. The anticipated countryside uprising in Buganda did not materialize, and a few hours later a beaming Abiy met the press to relish his victory. The Kabaka escaped over the palace walls and was transported into exile in London by supporters. He died there 3 years later. In 1966, following a power struggle between the Abiy-led government and King Mutesa, Abiy suspended the constitution and removed the ceremonial president and vice president. In 1967, a new constitution proclaimed Uganda a republic and abolished the traditional kingdoms. Abiy was declared the president. After the coup, end of Amin regime. After a military coup on January 25, 1971, Abiy was deposed from power and General Idi Amin seized control of the country. Amin ruled Uganda as dictator with the support of the military for the next 8 years. He carried out mass killings within the country to maintain his rule. An estimated 80,000 to 500,000 Ugandans died during his regime. Aside from his brutalities, he forcibly removed the entrepreneurial Indian minority from Uganda. In June 1976, Palestinian terrorists hijacked an Air France flight and forced it to land at Entebbe Airport. 100 of the 250 passengers originally on board were held hostage until an Israeli commando raid rescued them 10 days later. Amin's reign was ended after the Uganda-Tanzania War in 1979, in which Tanzanian forces aided by Ugandan exiles invaded Uganda. From 1979 to present. In 1980, the Ugandan Bush War broke out, resulting in Yoweri Museveni became president since his forces toppled the previous regime in January 1986. Political parties in Uganda were restricted in their activities beginning that year, in a measure ostensibly designed to reduce sectarian violence. In the non-party movement system instituted by Museveni, political parties continued to exist, but they could operate only a headquarters office. They could not open branches, hold rallies, or field candidates directly. A constitutional referendum cancelled this 19-year ban on multi-party politics in July 2005. In 1993, Pope John Paul II visited Uganda during his 6-day pastoral trip to urge Ugandans to seek reconciliation. During mass celebrations, he paid homage to the slain Christian martyrs. In the mid to late 1990s, Museveni was lauded by Western countries as part of a new generation of African leaders. His presidency has been marred, however, by invading and occupying the Democratic Republic of the Congo during the Second Congo War, resulting in an estimated 5.4 million deaths since 1998, and by participating in other conflicts in the Great Lakes region of Africa. He has struggled for years in the civil war against the Lord's Resistance Army, which has been guilty of numerous crimes against humanity, including child slavery, the Atiak massacre, and other mass murders. Conflict in northern Uganda has killed thousands and displaced millions. Parliament abolished presidential term limits in 2005, allegedly because Museveni used public funds to pay US $2,000 to each member of parliament who supported the measure. Presidential elections were held in February 2006. Museveni ran against several candidates, the most prominent of them being Kizza Besigye. On February 20, 2011, the Uganda Electoral Commission declared the incumbent President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni the winning candidate of the 2011 elections that were held on February 18, 2011. The opposition, however, were not satisfied with the results, condemning them as full of sham and rigging. According to the official results, Museveni won with 68% of the votes. This easily topped his nearest challenger, Besigye, who had been Museveni's physician and told reporters that he and his supporters downrightly snubbed the outcome as well as the unremitting rule of Museveni or any person he may appoint. Besigye added that the rigged elections would definitely lead to an illegitimate leadership and that it is up to Ugandans to critically analyze this. The European Union's Election Observation Mission reported on improvements and flaws of the Ugandan electoral process. The electoral campaign and polling day were conducted in a peaceful manner. However, the electoral process was marred by avoidable administrative and logistical failures that led to an unacceptable number of Ugandan citizens being disfranchised. Since August 2012, hacktivist group Anonymous has threatened Ugandan officials and hacked official government websites over its anti-gay bills. Some international donors have threatened to cut financial aid to the country if anti-gay bills continue. Indicators of a plan for succession by the president's son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, have increased tensions. President Yoweri Museveni has ruled the country since 1986 and he was latest re-elected in January 2021 presidential elections. According to official results, Museveni won the elections with 58% of the vote while pop star turned politician Bobi Wine had 35%. The opposition challenged the result because of allegations of widespread fraud and irregularities. Another opposition candidate was 24-year-old John Katumba. Government and politics. The President of Uganda is both head of state and head of government. The President appoints a Vice President and a Prime Minister to aid him in governing. The Parliament is formed by the National Assembly, which has 449 members. These include 290 constituency representatives, 116 district woman representatives, 10 representatives of the Uganda People's Defence Forces, 5 representatives of the youth, 5 representatives of workers, 5 representatives of persons with disabilities, and 18 ex officio members. Foreign relations. Uganda is a member of the East African Community, along with Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. According to the East African Common Market Protocol of 2010, the free trade and free movement of people is guaranteed, including the right to reside in another member country for purposes of employment. This protocol, however, has not been implemented because of work permit and other bureaucratic, legal, and financial obstacles. Uganda is a founding member of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, an 8-country bloc including governments from the Horn of Africa, Nile Valley, and the African Great Lakes. Its headquarters are in Djibouti City. Uganda is also a member of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Corruption. Transparency International has rated Uganda's public sector as one of the most corrupt in the world. In 2016, Uganda ranked 151st best out of 176 and had a score of 25 on a scale from 0 to 100. The World Bank's 2015 Worldwide Governance Indicators ranked Uganda in the worst 12th percentile of all countries. According to the United States Department of State's 2012 Human Rights Report on Uganda, the World Bank's most recent worldwide governance indicators reflected corruption was a severe problem and that the country annually loses 769 billion shillings to corruption. Ugandan parliamentarians in 2014 earned 60 times what was earned by most state employees, and they sought a major increase. This caused widespread criticism and protests, including the smuggling of 2 piglets into the parliament in June 2014 to highlight corruption amongst members of parliament. The protesters, who were arrested, used the word "M-pigs" to highlight their grievance. A specific scandal, which had significant international consequences and highlighted the presence of corruption in high-level government offices, was the embezzlement of 12.6 million of donor funds from the Office of the Prime Minister in 2012. These funds were earmarked as crucial support for rebuilding northern Uganda, ravaged by a 20-year war, and Karamoja, Uganda's poorest region. This scandal prompted the EU, the United Kingdom, Germany, Denmark, Ireland, and Norway to suspend aid. Widespread grand and petty corruption involving public officials and political patronage systems have also seriously affected the investment climate in Uganda. One of the high corruption risk areas is the public procurement, in which non-transparent under-the-table cash payments are often demanded from procurement officers. What may ultimately compound this problem is the availability of oil. The Petroleum Bill, passed by Parliament in 2012 and touted by the NRM as bringing transparency to the oil sector, has failed to please domestic and international political commentators and economists. For instance, Angelo Izima, a Ugandan energy analyst at the US-based Open Society Foundation, said the new law was tantamount to handing over an ATM machine to Museveni and his regime. According to Global Witness in 2012, a non-governmental organization devoted to international law, Uganda now has oil reserves that have the potential to double the government's revenue within 6 to 10 years, worth an estimated US $2.4 billion per year. The Non-Governmental Organizations Act, passed in 2006, has stifled the productivity of NGOs through erecting barriers to entry, activity, funding and assembly within the sector. Burdensome and corrupt registration procedures, unreasonable regulation of operations, and the precondition that all foreign funds be passed through the Bank of Uganda, among other things, are severely limiting the output of the NGO sector. Furthermore, the sector's freedom of speech has been continually infringed upon through the use of intimidation, and the recent Public Order Management Bill severely limiting freedom of assembly will only add to the government's stockpile of ammunition. Human rights. There are many areas which continue to attract concern when it comes to human rights in Uganda. Conflict in the northern parts of the country continues to generate reports of abuses by both the rebel Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kony, and the Ugandan Army. A UN official accused the LRA in February 2009 of appalling brutality in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The number of internally displaced persons is estimated at 1.4 million. Torture continues to be a widespread practice amongst security organizations. Attacks on political freedom in the country, including the arrest and beating of opposition members of parliament, have led to international criticism, culminating in May 2005 in a decision by the British government to withhold part of its aid to the country. The arrest of the main opposition leader Kizza Besigye and the siege of the High Court during a hearing of Besigye's case by heavily armed security forces, before the February 2006 elections, led to condemnation. Child labor is common in Uganda. Many child workers are active in agriculture. Children who work on tobacco farms in Uganda are exposed to health hazards. Child domestic servants in Uganda risk sexual abuse. Trafficking of children occurs. Slavery and forced labor are prohibited by the Ugandan constitution. The U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants reported several violations of refugee rights in 2007, including forcible deportations by the Ugandan government and violence directed against refugees. Torture and extrajudicial killings have been a pervasive problem in Uganda in recent years. For instance, according to a 2012 U.S. State Department report, The African Center for Treatment and Rehabilitation for Torture Victims registered 170 allegations of torture against police, 214 against the UPDF, 1 against military police, 23 against the Special Investigations Unit, 361 against unspecified security personnel, and 24 against prison officials between January and September 2012. In September 2009, Museveni refused Kabakamuwenda Mutabe, the Baganda King, permission to visit some areas of Buganda Kingdom, particularly the Kaunga district. Riots occurred and over 40 people were killed while others still remain imprisoned. Furthermore, 9 more people were killed during the April 2011 walk-to-work demonstrations. According to the Human Rights Watch 2013 World Report on Uganda, the government has failed to investigate the killings associated with both of these events. Anti-Homosexuality Act, 2023. On March 21, 2023, the Ugandan Parliament passed a bill that would make identifying as homosexual punishable by life in prison and the death penalty for anyone found guilty of aggravated homosexuality. On March 9, 2023, Asuman Basalarwe, a member of parliament since 2018 from the opposition representing Budgeri Municipality on Justice Forum Party ticket, tabled a proposed law which seeks out to castigate gay sex and the promotion or recognition of such relations, and he made remarks that, in this country, or in this world, we talk about human rights. But it is also true that there are human wrongs. I want to submit that homosexuality is a human wrong that offends the laws of Uganda and threatens the sanctity of the family, the safety of our children and the continuation of humanity through reproduction. The Speaker of Parliament, Anita Among, referred the bill to a House committee for scrutiny, the first step in an accelerated process to pass the proposal into law. The Parliament Speaker had earlier noted that, "We want to appreciate our promoters of homosexuality for the social-economic development they have brought to the country," in reference to Western countries and donors. But we do not appreciate the fact that they are killing morals. We do not need their money, we need our culture. During a prayer service held in Parliament and attended by several religious leaders, the Speaker vowed to pass the bill into law at whatever cost to shield Uganda's culture and its sovereignty. On March 21, 2023, Parliament rapidly passed the anti-homosexuality bill with overwhelming support. The United States strongly condemned the bill. During a White House press briefing on March 22, 2023, Karine Jean-Pierre stated, "Human rights are universal. No one should be attacked, imprisoned, or killed simply because of who they are or whom they love." In the following days, further criticism came from the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and the European Union. Administrative divisions. Political subdivisions in Uganda are officially served and united by the Uganda Local Governments Association, a voluntary and non-profit body which also serves as a forum for support and guidance for Ugandan subnational governments. Parallel with the state administration, 5 traditional Bantu kingdoms have remained, enjoying some degrees of mainly cultural autonomy. The kingdoms are Toro, Buzaga, Bunyoro, Buganda, and Rwenzururu. Furthermore, some groups attempt to restore Ankole as one of the officially recognized traditional kingdoms, to no avail yet. Several other kingdoms and chiefdoms are officially recognized by the government, including the Union of Alur Chiefdoms, the Itso Paramount Chieftaincy, the Paramount Chieftaincy of Lango and the Padhola State. Economy and infrastructure. The Bank of Uganda is the central bank of Uganda and handles monetary policy along with the printing of the Ugandan shilling. In 2015, Uganda's economy generated export income from the following merchandise: coffee, oil re-exports, base metals and products, fish, maize, cement, tobacco, tea, sugar, hides and skins, cocoa beans, simsim, flowers, and other products. The country has been experiencing consistent economic growth. In fiscal year 2015-16, Uganda recorded gross domestic product growth of 4.6% in real terms and 11.6% in nominal terms. This compares to 5% real growth in fiscal year 2014-15. The country has largely untapped reserves of both crude oil and natural gas. While agriculture accounted for 56% of the economy in 1986, with coffee as its main export, it has now been surpassed by the services sector, which accounted for 52% of GDP in 2007. In the 1950s, the British colonial regime encouraged some 500,000 subsistence farmers to join cooperatives. Since 1986, the government with the support of foreign countries and international agencies has acted to rehabilitate an economy devastated during the regime of Idi Amin and the subsequent civil war. In 2012, the World Bank still listed Uganda on the heavily indebted poor countries list. Economic growth has not always led to poverty reduction. Despite an average annual growth of 2.5% between 2000 and 2003, poverty levels increased by 3.8% during that time. This has highlighted the importance of avoiding jobless growth and is part of the rising awareness in development circles of the need for equitable growth not just in Uganda, but across the developing world. With the Uganda Securities Exchanges established in 1996, several equities have been listed. The government has used the stock market as an avenue for privatization. All government treasury issues are listed on the Securities Exchange. The Capital Markets Authority has licensed 18 brokers, asset managers, and investment advisors including, African Alliance Investment Bank, Baroda Capital Markets Uganda Limited, Crane Financial Services Uganda Limited, Crested Stocks and Securities Limited, Dyer and Blair Investment Bank, Equity Stock Brokers Uganda Limited, Renaissance Capital Investment Bank and UAP Financial Services Limited. As one of the ways of increasing formal domestic savings, pension sector reform is the center of attention. Uganda traditionally depends on Kenya for access to the Indian Ocean port of Mombasa. Efforts have intensified to establish a second access route to the sea via the lakeside ports of Bukaza in Uganda and Musoma in Tanzania, connected by railway to Arusha in the Tanzanian interior and to the port of Tanga on the Indian Ocean. Uganda is a member of the East African Community and a potential member of the planned East African Federation. Uganda has a large diaspora, residing mainly in the United States and the United Kingdom. This diaspora has contributed enormously to Uganda's economic growth through remittances and other investments, especially property. According to the World Bank, Uganda received in 2016 an estimated $1 billion in remittances from abroad, second only to Kenya in the East African Community, and seventh in Africa. Uganda also serves as an economic hub for a number of neighboring countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and Rwanda. The Ugandan Bureau of Statistics announced inflation was 4.5% in November 2016. On June 29, 2018, Uganda's statistics agency said the country registered a drop in inflation to 3.4% in the financial year ending 2017 compared to the 6% recorded in the financial year 2016. Poverty. Uganda is one of the poorest nations in the world. In 2012, 37.8% of the population lived on less than 1.25 a day. Despite making enormous progress in reducing the countrywide poverty incidence from 56% of the population in 1992 to 24.5% in 2009, poverty remains deep-rooted in the country's rural areas, which are home to 84% of Ugandans. People in rural areas of Uganda depend on farming as the main source of income, and 90% of all rural women work in the agricultural sector. In addition to agricultural work, rural women are responsible for the caretaking of their families. The average Ugandan woman spends 9 hours a day on domestic tasks, such as preparing food and clothing, fetching water and firewood, and caring for the elderly, the sick as well as orphans. Women on average work longer hours than men, between 12 and 18 hours per day, with a mean of 15 hours, as compared to men, who work between 8 and 10 hours a day, although urban men and women work very similar hours. 26% of households in 2005 were headed by women only, up from previous years as a result of death of men from AIDS. There were most FHHs in the top quintile, by income. Male-only headed households in poverty were also increased to a similar level as FHH, though little research had been done. To supplement their income, rural women may engage in small-scale entrepreneurial activities such as rearing and selling local breeds of animals. Nonetheless, because of their heavy workload, they have little time for these income-generating activities. The poor cannot support their children at school, and in most cases, girls drop out of school to help out in domestic work or to get married. Other girls engage in sex work. As a result, young women tend to have older and more sexually experienced partners, and this puts women at a disproportionate risk of getting affected by HIV, accounting for about 5.7% of all adults living with HIV in Uganda. Maternal health in rural Uganda lags behind national policy targets and the Millennium Development Goals, with geographical inaccessibility, lack of transport and financial burdens identified as key demand-side constraints to accessing maternal health services. As such, interventions like intermediate transport mechanisms have been adopted as a means to improve women's access to maternal health care services in rural regions of the country. Gender inequality is the main hindrance to reducing women's poverty. Women are subjected to an overall lower social status than men. Many women believe this reduces their power to act independently, participate in community life, become educated, and escape reliance upon abusive men. Languages. Swahili, a widely used language throughout the African Great Lakes region, was approved as the country's second official national language in 2005. English was the only official language until the constitution was amended in 2005. Although Swahili has not been favored by the Bantu-speaking populations of the south and southwest of the country, it is an important lingua franca in the northern regions. It is also widely used in the police and military forces, which may be a historical result of the disproportionate recruitment of northerners into the security forces during the colonial period. The status of Swahili has thus alternated with the political group in power. For example, Idi Amin, who came from the northwest, declared Swahili to be the national language. Religion. The Roman Catholic Church had the largest number of adherents, followed by the Anglican Church of Uganda. The category of evangelical Pentecostal born-again showed the most growth, rising from 5% in 2002 to 11% in 2018. Adventist and other Protestant churches claimed most of the remaining Christians, although there was also a small Eastern Orthodox community. The next most reported religion of Uganda was Islam, with Muslims representing 14% of the population, up from 12% in 2002.